Hi, this is Matt Baker, and today I'm going to talk about the pre-Columbian Americas. I'll once again be using one of the 4 foldout charts found in my Timeline of World History book, this time the chart about the Americas. So this video is going to be similar to the previous ones we made about the Asia and Africa charts. Again, please note that we don't actually sell a copy of the book on the Useful Charts website. However, I'll leave some links in the description and pinned comment. You can usually find it on Amazon and at most bookstores. Okay, so let's open up the book and turn to the Americas section. As usual, the chart opens up like this. If we zoom in to the top, you'll see that this time the timeline has 3 main sections. On the left, we have the Andean peoples from South America, and on the right, we have the various peoples from North America. In the middle are the Mesoamericans. Meso literally means middle, and in this case, it refers to the fact that Mesoamerica is in between the main part of North America and South America. So basically, when we say Mesoamerica, we're talking about what is now called Mexico and Central America. As usual, the chart starts in the year 800 BCE, but I do want to point out 2 civilizations that existed in the Americas before this point. So let's quickly refer to the main chart, which starts further back. The first civilization I want to point out is the Norte Chico civilization, which was located in the Andes in what is today Peru. It ranks as one of the 4 oldest civilizations in the entire world and was flourishing at the exact same time as the Egyptian, Sumerian, and Indus Valley civilizations. Those last 3 were located near each other though, and thus had an advantage. In contrast, the Norte Chico civilization was all alone, literally on the other side of the planet. This is probably why, even though they built large stone structures, they didn't have certain other things you might have expected, such as pottery or written symbols. The other civilization I want to point out is the Poverty Point culture, which was located along the Mississippi River in what is today the US. Now, I suppose I should take a moment to define the word civilization. First of all, I want to make it clear that civilizations are not necessarily better than other forms of human society. A civilization is simply a term that historians use to refer to a certain kind of human society, one that involves things like permanent settlements, large architectural projects, and differing social classes. A lot of people assume that these sorts of things simply did not exist in North America prior to European arrival, but they did, and Poverty Point is a good example of that. It is one of the earliest examples of North American mound building, a tradition that lasted over 5,000 years. These large mounds were likely built over time and served a variety of purposes, including a place to bury important people, a location for housing, and possibly a focal point for religious ceremonies. But whatever their exact purpose, the mounds at Poverty Point certainly point to the existence of some sort of advanced civilization. Okay, let's now return to the year 800 BCE. At this point, the most quote-unquote advanced civilization in the Americas was definitely that of the Olmecs. Now, again, I put quotes around the word advanced to serve as a reminder that I'm not making value judgments here. When I say advanced, I'm simply pointing out that it was the type of society that had more cities, more large structures, and more material goods. So yeah, the Olmecs were the first advanced civilization to arise in Mesoamerica, and therefore they can also be seen as kind of the parent culture for every other Mesoamerican civilization that followed. And this is important because from this point forward, it will be Mesoamerica that will be the location for the most advanced civilizations in the Americas. Yes, there will continue to be a lot of interesting things happening to the north and to the south, but it will be in Mesoamerica that writing will develop, and that the largest cities and buildings will be built. Roughly speaking, the Olmecs were the contemporaries of the first classical civilizations in Europe and the Middle East. So, at the same time that the Persians and the Greeks were experiencing their golden ages, the Olmecs were building these massive stone heads, creating really beautiful jade figurines, inventing the Mesoamerican ball game, and, in a first for the Americas, keeping written records. Although, unfortunately, we have no idea what these Olmec symbols mean. But for some reason, there was a major drop in the Olmec population around the year 400 BCE. After that, the Olmec civilization went into decline and would eventually be replaced by several new civilizations, including the Mayans, the Zapotecs, and the people of Teotihuacan. But before we look at them, let me first switch over and talk a bit more about the North American First Peoples. I've already mentioned the mound builders, but they were just one of many different cultures that existed in what is today the US and Canada. In Canada, we call the original inhabitants of our country First Nations. In the US, the term Native American is more frequently used. And from what I understand, some Native American groups even still prefer to use the word Indian, even though here in Canada, we try to avoid that word, because not only is it a misnomer, it is also considered offensive. I think the best practice is to try and use more specific terms whenever possible. After all, the Native Americans were never a single united group of people. So, for example, on this chart, I've divided the North American First Peoples into 5 major categories based on location. Obviously, I could have divided things even further, but for the sake of this brief overview, these 5 at least give us some sense of the differences in culture that existed due to the largeness of the continent. So, for example, in what is today the American Southwest, there developed a unique culture that was known for its basket making. It was also there that the cultivation of corn was first introduced, probably from Mesoamerica. In contrast, people living on the Great Plains lived a very different lifestyle. They continued to hunt the American buffalo, as they had done for thousands of years. Along the Pacific Northwest, the nations there enjoyed an abundance of natural resources due to the pleasant climate and easy access to the sea. Because food sources were so easy to come by, they had the advantage of having more free time to pursue other things, such as art, which is why the Pacific Northwest is famous for its unique artistic creations. But unlike the stereotypical view, Native Americans did not just rely on hunting and fishing. For example, in the eastern woodlands region, which was where the mound builders were located, there were permanent settlements, agriculture, and pottery. Just like in Europe around the same time. Finally, I want to point out the Dorset people who arrived in the Arctic region during this period. I'll be mentioning them again a bit later. Okay, so let's now return to Mesoamerica. Around the same time that the Roman Empire was dominating the Mediterranean world, Teotihuacan, in what is today Mexico, was the largest city in all of the Americas. At its peak, it reached a population of around 125,000. It was the location of the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon, 2 of the largest structures ever built in the pre-Columbian Americas. But perhaps more well known is the nearby Mayan civilization, which existed around the same time. The reason why we know so much about the Mayans is because their writing system was deciphered in the 20th century. We therefore know a lot about their various rulers and religious ideas, and about their keen interest in math and astronomy. In fact, we know that they used a very intricate calendar system, one which might have been inherited from the Olmecs. But one thing I want to point out about the Mayans, which some people might not realize, is that there was never such a thing as a Mayan empire, or kingdom of the Mayans. Like most Mesoamerican civilizations, Mayan society was organized around independent city-states, so they were never unified in the way that Rome or China was. It was during the classical Mayan period, approximately 300 to 900 CE, that the Nazca culture was flourishing in South America, not far from where the Norte Chico civilization had existed 3,000 years earlier. The Nazca are mostly remembered for creating these large, somewhat mysterious geoglyphs that can only be fully seen and understood from the air. But they also created some of the most artistically advanced pottery and textiles ever made in the ancient world. Eventually, their culture was replaced by two distinct civilizations, the Hawari Empire and the Tiwanaku Empire. Interestingly, as far as we know, these two empires coexisted side by side without any military conflicts. It was in Tiwanaku that the Gate of the Sun was created, out of a single 10-ton stone. Let's now jump back to North America, so I can point out a few things that were happening there around the same time as the Mayans. From approximately 200 BCE to 500 CE, the Eastern Woodlands region experienced a long period of growth and stability based on a system of connected cultures known as the Hopewell tradition. This period saw an increase in social stratification, the construction of larger mounds, as well as the development of an extensive trade network, through which many different types of artwork were exchanged. And it was near the end of this period that the bow and arrow was introduced. Prior to this, spears would have been used for hunting, but from this point forward, it was archery. However, for some reason, around the year 500 CE, the Hopewell tradition went into a rather sudden decline. This coincides with the start of the medieval period in Europe, and in both cases, the sudden shifts in culture were probably caused in part by the extreme weather events that are known to have occurred in the year 536. The leading theory is that the extreme weather, which led to a major drop in temperature, was caused by a volcanic eruption somewhere on the planet, and by the subsequent ash that entered the atmosphere and spread over large portions of the Earth. I should note, however, that the Mayan civilization did not collapse at the same time as the Hopewell tradition. The Mayans did also suffer from a rather sudden collapse due to reasons that are still being debated, but that occurred around 400 years later, around the year 900 CE. The decline in the Mayan civilization coincided with the rise of the Toltecs. A lot of what we know about the Toltecs come from later Aztec records, and from the fact that the Aztecs greatly admired the Toltecs as their legendary forefathers. But I want to keep the focus on North America for now, because from approximately 1000 CE to 1300 CE, there were two highly advanced civilizations in what is today the United States that tend to be downplayed in the history books. Because these civilizations had already gone into decline before the Europeans arrived, the Europeans assumed that the inhabitants of the so-called New World were extremely primitive, an idea that has stuck to this very day. But had the Europeans arrived just a few centuries earlier, they would have encountered a much different situation. Around the year 1000, the eastern woodland populations once again became more centralized, and mound building started up again, this time reaching its most developed stage. The civilization that existed in the eastern half of the US during this period is called the Mississippian culture, and it consisted of several relatively large cities, such as Cahokia, which likely had a population of around 20,000 people. Interestingly, the flourishing of the Mississippian culture roughly correlates with the medieval warm period, a period of around 300 years when temperatures in the North Atlantic were significantly higher. By this point, three important crops, beans, squash, and corn, known as the Three Sisters, had reached the eastern woodlands, so probably the introduction of these new food sources, combined with the warm weather, helped settlements to grow and thrive. The other civilization that I want to point out during this period is the Puebloan civilization in what is today the American Southwest. The word pueblo means town or village and is associated with a type of housing made primarily out of mud bricks rather than wood or stone. During the Great Pueblo period, multi-storied dwellings were built in this style, sometimes on the sides of cliffs. So, yeah, the idea that all Native Americans lived in teepees and had a migratory life is simply not true. But like I said, around the year 1300, both the Mississippian culture and the Great Pueblo culture experienced a rapid decline, to the point that when the Europeans arrived, the cultures that they found were quite a bit different. A lot of migration also occurred during the centuries just before European arrival. For example, in the far north, the Dorset people, who I mentioned earlier, were completely replaced by the Inuit, which is why the Inuit are not considered to be First Nations. Also, certain Athabascan-speaking groups from the subarctic region migrated quite a bit south, where they became known as the Navajo. Finally, there was, very generally speaking, a shift westward, with some groups who had previously lived in the eastern woodlands migrating towards the Great Plains. So by the time Christopher Columbus landed in the Bahamas, North America looked something like this, with 6 major ethno-linguistic groups and many more smaller ones, especially along the west coast. But my main point is this. One cannot assume that the location of the indigenous people groups in the year 1500 were the exact same locations that they had lived in for thousands of years, nor can we assume that their cultures and lifestyles were static. As we've just discussed, people groups moved around and there were waxings and wanings in terms of the amount of trade and large-scale building projects that were taking place. Okay, the final 2 civilizations I need to point out are the Incas and the Aztecs. The Incas lived in the Andes in South America, whereas the Aztecs lived in Mesoamerica, around what is today Mexico City. The Incas were the ones who built Machu Picchu, the famous mountaintop retreat that was used primarily by their elite. Whereas the Aztecs were the ones who built the city of Tenochtitlan, the largest city-state in the Americas at the time of European arrival. We did a video about the Aztec emperor's family tree, so if you want to learn more about them, I suggest you check out that video, which I'll link to in the description. So just like I did in my videos on the Asian timeline and the African timeline, I would like to end by pointing out that this was just a very brief, obviously incomplete overview of the subject. My purpose was not to tell you everything that has ever happened in the region, but rather to give you an outline of the major civilizations and when they existed. You can then use this as a springboard for further research. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you want a copy of the book, which includes this chart and several others, you can check out the links in the description or pinned comment. Thanks for watching.